It's Friday, it's 11:45 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Labour MP Jess Phillips, the activist and Boris Johnson supporter Nimco Ali, the Times journalist Rachel Sylvester and the trade unionist and journalist Paul Embury. So, what's going on today? It's crunch time as Conservative Party members receive their ballot papers and voting begins. The two candidates continue their dash around the country with hustings in the North East and Scotland, but the warnings continue over a no-deal Brexit.
We shouldn't leave without a deal. I think we should leave with a deal.
It would be, frankly, rather shocking if the House of Commons, the elected representatives of the people, could be simply sidelined.
My guest, Jess Phillips, will be leaving her son on the steps of Downing Street later in a protest about school funding. So why are some schools closing early on a Friday? And it's London Pride tomorrow, but has it lost its political roots and just become an excuse for one big party? So let's return to the story of protesters from a number of schools around the country are on the march in Westminster today, including Jess Phillips and her son, as we said. Hundreds of schools say they are forced to close early on Fridays because they can't afford to stay open the full week. So the question is, who's to blame? The schools themselves, because not all schools close early on a Friday, or the government?
Well, I mean, it is the basic principle that the government is responsible to keep our kids in education, and they are failing all over the country. It's not just the case in my son's school. There are thousands of children who are on shorter hours. What the government wants to say is it's that head teachers are managing their budgets poorly and some are managing better, but that is to assume that all schools have all the exact same experiences, the exact same demographics, the exact same makeup, and that is, of course, not true, and I frankly should expect the Department for Education to know that.
Right, Nimco, would you blame schools or government?
I think I'll blame society altogether. So we've spent such a long time focusing on higher education, we've actually forgot about primary and secondary education.
Is that the government's fault?
That's the government's fault, and also the introduction of a lot of lobbyists like that bought in free schools is also another issue as well. The fact that I think we've lost the ability for the government to really control schools, and it's all kind of gone into a private sector. So, yeah. Right.
Is it the fault of schools themselves when there are hundreds of other schools that manage to stay open all week?
I think the schools that close really feel forced into it, and it's the front line of austerity. They have borne the brunt of these cuts, and the closures really hits both working parents and children. So I think that's why it's got this kind of huge public appetite for protest against it. And the teachers are very reasonable advocates for an argument. There was one banner at a protest recently where the head teachers had "relentlessly reasonable" as their, chant. And
right.
These aren't rabble-rousers.
Relentlessly reasonable. Catchy. Paul?
I think it's undoubtedly a result of austerity. I mean, I've seen it myself in my own service, the Fire and Rescue Service, where we've seen a cut of central government funding of something like a third since 2010. I've no doubt that similar things are happening in the education system as well. And one thing that strikes me is the impact it has not just on the kids, but on the parents. On a Friday afternoon when the kids are not in school, they've got to rearrange childcare, pay for extra childcare, possibly take time off of work. And I just find it ironic that parents would be fined for taking their kids out of school, but are being told, actually, we can't afford to educate your kids 5 days a week.
Well, let's show this statement from the Department for Education. We did ask someone from the department to come on, but none was available. The funding for an average primary class of 28 in Birmingham is £125,000 above the national average of £115,000 for an equivalent size class. These amounts are to cover a full 5-day week in term time. The government says Birmingham schools are doing relatively well.
Well, the government, for a start off, 28 kids in the class. My son's has got 33, so the government doesn't know... I was going to swear then, I shouldn't do that.
Try not to, please.
It doesn't know what it's talking about. I wish there was only 28 kids in my son's class. What they keep on saying is, oh, we're putting more money than ever into education. As if my kid's school has chosen to do this. You should see the look on the face of the head teacher of my son's school, or the 3 schools in my constituency who've had to do this. They are bereft. This is the government's responsibility. It's a basic fundamental that children should be in school 5 days a week.
Should it be a bigger priority in the leadership campaign, Nimco? Because actually, Jeremy Hunt has spoken more about further education. Boris Johnson has put a figure on how much extra he would put into schools in England in terms of funding. It's £49 million. I mean, it's peanuts.
Well, honestly, education is a fundamental part. I think we should be talking about anything but Brexit at the moment. There's education, there's health, there's a lot of things that we should be talking about. But I'm not in either of their kind of campaigns, so they want to talk about whatever they want to talk about. But ultimately, education is a fundamental thing. I think New Labour brought it to the heart of the government and the campaign. And I would like to see. I don't want to blame teachers and I don't want to blame parents, but I think the government needs to listen to them.
Can I just make the point? Boris Johnson has got no solution to this, as far as I'm concerned. One of the priorities of his leadership campaign was to reduce tax rates for some of the better off people in society. That plainly will have the knock-on effects of reducing tax revenues and giving government less money to spend. So the idea that Boris Johnson, who's a cutter and slasher, I was a firefighter in London when he closed 10 fire stations and reduced the number of firefighters by 600. And imposed the biggest cuts on the London Fire Brigade since the Second World War. The idea that he's interested in investing in public services when he's actually a neoliberal Thatcherite, I think is laughable.
Nimco?
I think that's completely unfair. I'm not here as his spokesperson, but ultimately...
So you are supporting him?
I am supporting him, and I think he would be a good Prime Minister, and I do believe in the things that I really fundamentally care about, which is welfare and also women's rights. He's been very supportive of that, but ultimately, to sit here and say that Boris Johnson doesn't care about education, doesn't care about the young people of this country, that's actually a fallacy.
The reality is, though, the figure that if he's floating, was it 49 million that you said? It's
which is actually a 0.1% increase, which is
absolutely
low.
Woeful. I mean, even just to reach inflation, you're going to have to put in 1.2.
Is it about money? Is it just about money, though, Rachel? I mean, is it also about the way schools are managed? They have got more freedoms to do so, particularly in academies, to run their own affairs in a way that will be beneficial to them.
I think in the end, the early closures is about money. They haven't got the funds to pay the teachers, and they're having to also lay off teachers. And I think it's the fact that both the leadership contenders in the Tory contest have raised this as an issue and said they will find more money, whether or not it's enough, shows that the current situation isn't working.
Now, what about leaving your son on the streets of Downing Street? You know, is Theresa May going to be looking after him? She's not even there.
I mean, I feel for Theresa May. You know, I'm not keen on the woman particularly, but I think that she would struggle to handle my son for even 20 minutes.
I mean, do you think that's responsible of Jess Phillips to be taking her child out of school and then dumping him on number 10?
I think there'll be plenty of nice policemen around to look after him.
So it's free childcare.
I would never leave my children with a senior Tory, whether it's the Prime Minister or anyone else. I've got to be honest.
Is that tribal, Paul?
I'm a Labour tribalist. I'm not ashamed.
No, I just said that's completely unnecessary thing to say. But ultimately, I do think it's better to leave him at number 10 than to leave him at the pub. We were just having a conversation saying that a former Prime Minister did forget his child.
All right. Well, look, we've been talking a little bit about Boris Johnson. Let's just show you the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Boris Johnson, of course, has a column in the Daily Telegraph, and this is the headline: "This is the greatest place on earth. Boris Johnson promises to unite the country and improve the quality of life for everybody after Brexit." Well, one might say that's an optimistic view, Nimco, bearing in mind what's gone on with Brexit so far.
Well, it's optimistic, but he's the man to deliver Brexit, I think, and he's the man that I think the country can get behind. And ultimately, I think it's really unfair that a lot of people... I think Boris could deliver Brexit, could unite everybody, and a lot of people wouldn't necessarily still like him. And so, yeah, I've got nothing else to say from that.
Do you think he is the man to do it?
The problem is he's gone from being a sort of quite a unifying character when he was London Mayor to being a very divisive character. He's sort of gone from Heineken, who reaches out to the parts other politicians can't reach, to Marmite, which is you love him or you loathe him. And at a time when the country really needs to be brought together, I don't think he is such a divisive person. His comments on women in burqas, his comments on, you know, words I don't want to use on the television.
Yeah, but this is the point, is the fact that people love to pick out 2 or 3 lines and just, like, you know, plaster them all over the pages and have, like, you know, 3 or 4 articles about 2 or 3 lines. Ultimately, if people read what he says in context, he's not racist, he's not offensive, he's just having a point of view about certain things. And the burqa joke and the burqa line, as somebody from a community where the the policies and the beliefs that come with the burqa are things that scare me to my core. It was actually quite refreshing to see somebody say that this is what the burqa is actually quite ridiculous. And he said he wouldn't ban it and he wouldn't force it on somebody. So to say that it's Islamophobia or the attacks on women are a result of 2 lines in a Telegraph article and not because of the fact that men in my own community have held women's back for the last 3 or 4 decades.
Right. So, I mean, he's obviously a hero for Nimco in terms.
Yeah, and Nimco has her opinion. I have to say that Muslim women, where I live in Birmingham, are terrified about him becoming the Prime Minister.
Yes, they should be terrified about the fact that there are men like Abdul from Bristol who are the ones that are segregating women from men, who are actually starting
they are capable
of
not liking both of those things. But, you know, I think that the trouble with Boris Johnson is he says these things and then we're expected to just have them be throwaway lines, that's just Boris being Boris. Well, he's got to be responsible and he's got to answer to those. And unfortunately, at the moment, with loads of questions about his character or loads of questions about the things that he said before, he just thinks it's so arrogant and entitled the way he just thinks he can get away with it. The way that if I had said those things, I would be hounded out of politics. And it just gets away with it because he's like...
I think the danger is, though, if we concentrate on the things that he said and we magnify those things, we ignore the fact that actually he's just completely unfit in terms of ability to be the Prime Minister. I'm not that interested in what he might have said in the past. What matters to me is that the man, as far as I'm concerned, is a complete charlatan.
Yeah, but he's going to deliver what you want in terms of Brexit, isn't he, Paul?
Well, yeah, I'm a pro-Brexiteer. I'm one of those rare things on the left, a bit of a museum piece. But so in that respect, yes.
Right, so you would support him on that, on his claims that he will deliver Brexit?
Pro-Brexit, but as far as I'm concerned, that is secondary to what this country would be if Boris Johnson were to become Prime Minister.
Right, what about the fact that you, Nimco, you've said he is one of your feminist heroes. What makes Boris Johnson a feminist?
And what makes Boris Johnson a feminist is that he believes that the most vulnerable people on the planet, which are girls, should be protected and should be invested in. And I think it's very rare to find somebody that says that and comes out of his position of privilege and power and says, I'm going to actually stand in solidarity with you. I've seen Boris Johnson. The thing is that a lot of people want to magnify the things that Boris Johnson, 2 or 3 lines like that, and that he said, but you've not been there when he's taken African leaders to task, when he's actually advocated for 12 years of quality education, when he's actually understood that the realities of FGM means to women across the world. So for me, I need somebody, and we need somebody that stands...
He was part of a government and also in London that slashed women's services left, right and centre, that they are decimated, so that now every single day at least 118 women are turned away from refuge. You know, it's all well and good that if he can stand in let's face it, when he was the Foreign Secretary, it is a well-trodden path that the Foreign Secretary has had, and in international development has become much more feminist over the past 10 years. And rightly so, of course. But Boris Johnson, in his actions here in the UK, I cannot give you one example of a time where he has helped save a women's service or come out in any debate in Parliament and stood up for us.
He did set up the independent panel on violence against women and girls, and actually in London did reduce it, like, you know, violence against women and girls. Since Sadiq Khan has taken over, rape has gone up, domestic violence has gone up.
Because of Boris Johnson's...
OK, yeah, let's explain. This is the problem.
Honestly,
don't talk over each other. Answer each other.
Do you honestly think that Sadiq Khan has made rape go up, or the fact that our courts have been decimated, our police have been decimated, the fact that you can no longer, if you make a rape claim, you can your case will sit with investigation for maybe 2 years before it's even taken to
the CPS.
He's the Mayor of
London.
Because
he's the Mayor of London.
He's the Mayor of London.
So he's the Mayor of London. So he's the Mayor of London at the moment.
So why is rape up in Birmingham?
So Sadiq Khan's the Mayor of London. So we're talking about mayors of London.
Because it's got a Tory mayor. Okay. So why is rape up there?
OK, so we're going to blame Boris for Birmingham and for London, but he wasn't the Mayor of London. Because he's the Mayor of London. He's the Mayor of London. So let's talk about the Mayor of London, and he's the head of...
He was a terrible
Mayor. But Nimco, are there other concrete examples that you can give that would underline his feminist credentials? I mean, people will look also at his personal life and say, does he have enough respect for women?
He does have respect for women. I've known him for 9 years on a professional capacity, and I do believe that he's a man that actually cares about the fundamental things that really matter to women across the world. So that's like, you know, ending violence against women and girls on a global level, investment in education, and real investment in women in terms of microfinancing. So he does believe in a gender equal world, and that's what I'm, like, you know, fighting for. I'm not here to be his party political broadcaster, but that's ultimately the thing that I care about.
All right, well, let's end that then for you. But let's show our viewers your book, what we're told not to talk about, but we're going to anyway, Women's Voices from East London to Ethiopia. How and why and where would you like women to talk about these issues more? On programmes like this?
On programmes like this, on the Dispatch Box, and I would want, like, Boris and other people to talk about things that are in that book, about the fact that the rates of fistula in the developing countries, like, FGM, rape, domestic violence, things that we're told not to talk about, period poverty, which this government's doing stuff about. So ultimately, I'm a lobbyist, and it's about getting people to do the right thing, and Boris Johnson is the person that I think I can work with.
Generally, though, do you think this is a campaign that you would like to see and hear more of?
Yeah, I think it's a really important campaign. On the Boris issue, though, I think there is a gender gap, which is really interesting, and women are much more suspicious of him and worried about him. And I think it's partly a sort of character question, and also it's about his sense that he's reckless and irresponsible, and all the no deal talk plays into that.
Well, you mentioned no deal. Let's listen to this from the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. This is on the Political Thinking podcast with Nick Robinson, where he is asked about Parliament's chances of stopping no deal.
Well, let me quote the Speaker of the House of Commons, who has said that if the House of Commons is determined to do something, he's quite sure that it will find a way. And I am quite confident that the House of Commons will find a way, and indeed should be able to find a way, because this is a parliamentary democracy. And it would be, frankly, rather shocking if the House of Commons, the elected representatives of the people, could be simply sidelined by a government that was doing something that was the exact opposite of what the House of Commons clearly wanted done.
Just before I get your response, Paul, we're going to say goodbye to Jess Phillips, because I think you've got to go to Downing Street. Make sure your son is still there on the steps of number 10. Paul, what do you make of the Chancellor's comments that Parliament will find a way to stop no deal if it becomes the default option?
I think the problem has been for 3 years, and I say this as a trade union negotiator. If you incessantly give the impression to the other side that you must have a deal at all costs, and that you're never prepared to walk away from the table, then effectively you lose any leverage that you might have. And that has been the message from the government and from Parliament for the last 3 years. And what that does effectively is it gives the EU a veto, because the EU know that all they've got to do is offer us the worst possible deal, because ultimately, we're not going to accept no deal, and they're keen for us to stay inside the European Union, and we've played right into their hands, I believe.
But is Parliament within its rights to stop no deal, as Philip Hammond has said, and David Gauke agrees?
Well, I think the problem is this. People voted to leave the European Union. They didn't vote to leave only with a deal, a withdrawal agreement that the EU was prepared to sign. It did not say on the ballot paper, remain or leave only with a deal. It said leave. And the reality is, if we don't leave, and we should have left on March the 29th, but we didn't, my fear is if this thing goes on much longer, we are going to see a real crisis in democracy, where people effectively say we had the biggest democratic exercise in the history of this country, and you lot in Parliament have ignored it. What is the point of us voting again? And you will just, in my view, have mass abstentionism, and that would be a real problem for us.
But actually, Paul, in the Vote Leave campaign literature at the time of the referendum, they very specifically said that there would be a deal, and it would be leaving with a deal, and it would be a very stable, calm transition. There'd be no risks attached. It was absolutely explicit. I don't think there is a democratic mandate for a no deal.
All right.
Only a quarter of the voters
on the ballot
back
paper,
that.
Rachel, was
On
it?
that,
people say all sorts of things in elections and referendums. It's what's on the ballot paper that is the key thing.
and we're going to have to move on, I'm afraid. We're going to welcome in our next guest, Amru Al-Kadi, a writer and performer. And next week, just to remind you, we move into the second week of Wimbledon, and so once again, we're on air at the earlier time of 11:45 on BBC One on Monday, and BBC Two for the rest of the week, with our usual PMQs programme on Wednesday between 11:15 and 1 o'clock. Please join us then. Let's bring up the front page of Saturday's Times a week ago. Corbyn, too frail to be Prime Minister, fears civil service. This was an article written by you, Rachel. Just before I get your response, it went on to detail unattributed quotes and sources in the civil service saying that Corbyn wasn't physically fit in that sense. This was the response from Corbyn ally Len McCluskey from the Unite Union.
Rachel Sylvester and Alice Thompson, who wrote that piece, ought to be ashamed of themselves. It was a disgraceful thing. It was fake news, it was lies, it was distortions. Jeremy Corbyn is as fit as a fiddle. He's one of the strongest individuals I've ever met. People 20 years younger can't keep up with them. There's nothing wrong with Jeremy.
Rachel?
Well, we were reporting, obviously, what we'd been told. And what I think is fascinating about this story is the reaction Labour has had, and they have chosen to pick a fight on this. And Jeremy Corbyn has chosen to pick a fight. And I think there's a mixture of things. It's partly that they do believe there's some kind of deep state establishment out to thwart them. But also, I think that it's a massive distraction, a diversionary tactic from the real problems they've got over anti-Semitism and Brexit. And there are big, deep divides in the party. This is a great distraction to try and unite the base again against some kind of sinister establishment.
Do you think that's what's going on, Amru?
Well, I mean, if Corbyn had that sort of much of a bite in response to the anti-Semitism or even having a position on Brexit, I think the base, I mean, I voted Corbyn during the leadership election, I canvassed for him in 2017, and I'm now feeling politically a little bit homeless with him as someone who is an internationalist, and I think that should be one of Labour's key principles. Corbyn has not come out against stopping freedom of movement. He has no clear Brexit position, and we know he's a bit of a Eurosceptic. But I think the base has felt more disillusioned the fact that he can actually demonstrate such bravado when it comes to the Civil Service League and not on some two key fundamental principles in the Labour Party currently.
Paul, what did you make of the reaction? I mean, Rachel says it was very strong, forceful, the reaction from Labour. Was it a distraction? Was that what's about?
In terms of Rachel's story about the civil service, I mean, I take Rachel at her word. That's the information that she was given. But I think if we've got senior civil servants in this country actively going out to journalists and briefing what I consider to be inaccurate information about the health of the leader of the opposition, I think that's absolutely appalling, and I think it's a sign of what has become a more politicised civil service over the last 3 years. And I think the danger is the civil servants are supposed to work behind the scenes and maintain integrity and be impartial, and they're increasingly not doing that, and that's completely unacceptable.
Do you think there is a bias then that exists?
I think it's obvious. I mean, I remember the great story of A Very British Coup by Chris Mullin, and there was Harry Perkins, the left-wing Prime Minister, and there were stories from the right-wing tabloids about how his health was failing and he's got a really serious illness and stuff. And people say that truth is often sometimes stranger than fiction, but I've no doubt that there's a bias away from Corbyn and against Corbyn. Yeah. What's
it done to your relations with the Labour Party? Because you also have quotes from people talking about the leader's office as well, that Jeremy Corbyn being run ragged, and I mean he isn't a young man in that sense, despite Len McCluskey saying he's as fit as a fiddle. What's it done with relations?
Well, I think there is a real disenchantment among Labour MPs, including in the Shadow Cabinet, with the circle around Jeremy Corbyn, the 4 M's, as they call them, Carrie Murphy, Seamus Milne, Andrew Murray and Len McCluskey, who have him under an iron fist, if you like, and organise that office. And they treat the MPs with contempt. And there's a real frustration with that. And they are blamed for the mishandling of Brexit and of anti-Semitism.
But how are your relations with the Labour Party and the leader's office then after that?
Well, that's not my job to worry about.
You're not going dancing with Corbyn tonight.
I talk to lots of people from all parties, and that's my job.
I mean, in terms of the polling that's happened recently, the recent poll that put Labour in 4th place. Now, it has to come with a health warning, of course, and there isn't a general election imminently, and I mean in the next sort of few weeks, but even so, polling at 18%, Paul.
And it's a consequence of this sort of constructive ambiguity position that has completely fouled. I mean, Labour sort of flipped the coin and hoped it was going to land on its side rather than come down heads or tails. And unfortunately, what they've done is they've angered the millions of working class people in some of those post-industrial heartlands, those traditional Labour heartlands, millions of whom voted Leave, but now increasingly feel that the party doesn't speak for them. A second referendum would spell disaster for Labour if they supported it. They would hemorrhage even more support from those places. You look at the recent elections, they lost seats in places like Bolsover and Darlington and Burnley, real working class places, and it's because of their position.
Paul, but what if it's now looking like we're heading towards either a catastrophic no deal or some kind of amendment to the current Theresa May deal, and if both of those go through, I think there will be much more Labour disenchantment with Corbyn having facilitated what's essentially a Tory Brexit and a Brexit that is essentially a Tory project, I think there will be a lot more resentment from the
If you go to places, I mean, I think no deal comes with risks. I'm not blasé
90
about.
billion.
I'm not blasé about no deal, but I'm also quite precious about democracy as well. And if you go to places, traditional working class places like Mansfield and Stoke-on-Trent South and places like that, and ask them what they think about no deal, they don't have an issue with no deal. They want their vote to be respected, and if Labour is seen to be blocking their vote, then Labour is probably never going to win.
Well, except because we are going to have an electoral test at the by-election in Brecon and Radnorshire. Now we've got the anti-Brexit parties are going to collaborate, so they're only going to have one candidate in the Liberal Democrats. What will that do to Labour?
Well, also at the European election, the Labour vote split 3-1 in favour of the anti-Brexit parties rather than the pro-Brexit parties. So I think they're going to stand a very good chance, the Remain parties, of winning that seat.
And I do think, in terms of your point, which I understand that there is Leave constituencies that are working class, and many of whom voted for Brexit because of fears of immigration and that kind of thing. I do think Corbyn needs to come out and dispel a lot of those mythologies about immigration, the fact that immigrants provide 25 billion a year to the economy, that the NHS has a 110,000 people shortfall. And actually, if Corbyn came out against some of the mythologies constructed by the right about immigration, I think that would also speak to...
We're going to move on to London Pride because the parade, no, don't apologise, is being held tomorrow. Let's just show you the picture of number 10. Very colourful, as usual, adorned with flowers, getting into the spirit of it, as are lots of retailers and shops and businesses. Is there a sense that Pride somehow, the spirit has gone out of it and it's become too commercialised?
Well, I think Pride has become basically a pick-a-mix of corporations and institutions basically having a rainbow filter. And I think what worries me is that it gives the impression to the broader public that it's a great time to be LGBTQ in the UK, when actually, I mean, I speak with privilege living here and having lived in the Middle East and not being able to have a Pride, but we're actually seeing a lot of regression in terms of LGBTQ safety in Britain. There's been an 81% spike in transphobia this past year. 2 in 5 trans people have been attacked. And what happens with the parade is if you have money, you get a bigger float. I think it's about £3,000 you have to pay to get a large float. And as a result, institutions that have quite transphobic and racist policies are given a free ride. L'Oreal, for instance, which was pretty dismissive of its first black transgender activist, Monroe Bergdorf, gets a slot. And XXL, the guy who, it's a gay club that has said all Muslims should be shipped away from the UK, they get a float because they can afford it. And unfortunately, Pride is feeling increasingly unsafe to the people who are most unsafe in the
All right, Nimco?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It has just become so. I'm not gay. I'm straight, and I do acknowledge that privilege, but on a day-to-day basis within my own community and also within Europe. So I was in Budapest a few years ago, and the Pride there had to be guarded by police. People were getting bricked. Yeah, so ultimately, it's not as nice as just like a sunny day. And also, I heard the story of the homeless young people's LGBT float was taken off because it wasn't pretty enough. So we are getting to the point where you have to spend a lot of money in order to be part of something which is a celebration, which again comes back to something like the Notting Hill Carnival as well.
But it is a celebration. And
yeah, on the other hand, I do think there's something great about it's gone mainstream. So it's a real celebration, and that is something good, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, for instance, the Home Office had a rainbow filter on its Twitter logo at the same week deporting a Ugandan lesbian asylum seeker, which then the courts then said that was an unlawful deportation, and the Home Office has fought that.
So they should apply the rainbow filter properly.
They should pay reparations.
I mean, I think the truth is that Pride has become completely commercialised and corporatised now, and far removed from when it started in the 70s, when it was about very political. It was about liberation. And now you've got big institutions just completely throwing money at it. And I think the danger is actually some of that is just virtue signalling, where they fear that if they aren't seen to embrace it, then they're going to be accused of bigotry and not wanting to support Pride. And some of the gay people I speak to about it are now increasingly reluctant to get involved in it because they see it as just a vehicle for big business to tout their wares.
Right, but are we all going on Pride marches?
Are we going to Black Pride on Sunday? Which
Nimco?
I'm going to go to Black Pride as well.
You are? You too? Pride parties?
I've got to do something.
What about you, Joe?
Whatever you're doing, have a great weekend from all of us. Bye-bye.